What I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about the Empire Marketing Board Film Unit. I'll give a little bit of background on the Empire Marketing Board. I'm just going to call it the EMB because it's a bit of a mouthful otherwise. And so this talk's going to really look at the way that the British state sought to establish an agency, really a propaganda agency, to assist with the funding. Sorry, I'm getting a lot of noise here. Yeah, to assist with the. Can I just suggest something? If I should be better, hopefully. Yeah, sorry, there was a few unmuted microphones there. So yeah, I'm going to first of all talk about the setting up of the EMB, and I'm going to talk about what the purpose of the unit was. Particularly with reference to the film unit, but I'll give a broader introduction to the EMB itself. I'll talk about the films and the way that they use propaganda techniques to sell Empire to the public, British public, because the films that they made were widely shown in cinemas to paying audiences, as well as being broken up and used in sections as educational films, some of which are shown in schools and other institutions. And I'm going to talk about the way that the EMB sought to promote a particular view of Empire. I'm also going to talk very briefly at the end about the legacies of the EMB because it's quite important. So it's a very brief period. The Empire Marketing Board was set up in 1926, and it only existed until 1933, which is a very short space of time, and yet the legacies of the Empire Marketing Board are very considerable, and I think you can argue that they're still there within much of the ethos of the BBC today. So the idea came from Leopold Amery, who was a Conservative politician. You can see him up there on the left. He was colonial secretary in Stanley Baldwin's Conservative government, 1924 to 1929. And he set up the EMB with the broad aims, really, of promoting what he called imperial mindedness amongst the British public. He also talked about bringing the empire alive, which is a phrase that that was used really quite often in relation to the EMB. It was all part, in the sense of a broader policy that was very much about trying to promote the trade ties between Britain and its empire. And I think for those people, and there may be many of you here today, I don't know, who've been studying A326, or perhaps if you've studied that in the past, the module on empires, some of this will be a little familiar to you because it does sort of link up with some of the debates around the Mackenzie and Porter arguments, which some of you may well be with. Certainly it ties up with this notion that, what did the public know about empire? I don't think it can really answer the question, what did they care about empire? But I think it can certainly help to answer the question of what the government wanted the British public to know and why they wanted them to know it. And I think this is very much behind the creation of the unit in 1926. It came only a couple of years after the Empire exhibition of 1924, the Wembley exhibition, which had been a great success. It's often said that 28 million people went to see that exhibition. That's half the population. Well, actually more than half the population. Probably not, because probably it's multiple entries, actually. Nevertheless, it was very, very successful. Hello, sorry, I'm getting a lot of echo here. Otherwise, we're just going to get a lot of echo. Why the Empire Film Unit? Why the EMB Film Unit? So it was set up a little after the EMB itself was set up, with a specific aim of publicising, promoting imperial produce and trade. as was the case with the EMB in general. It was staffed by technocrats, by people with expertise from the world of advertising, the arts, science, media. But why was it seen as necessary? I think in economic terms, certainly in the 1920s, it was part of a response to the raising of tariffs against British goods and British Empire goods in other countries, sometimes referred to as economic nationalism. And certainly the EMB was a response to that. And it was part of a policy amongst some Conservative MPs and some who were in the cabinet, which wanted to create something called empire protectionism. The idea had been around since the late 19th century. Now, they couldn't do it. They couldn't achieve it. One of the reasons they couldn't do that in the 1920s was because by creating a sort of protected area around the empire, it would lead to even higher prices for food imports from outside of the empire. And this was not popular. So they didn't actually bring in empire protectionism yet. We'll come in the 1930s, though. But what they did do was to try to promote the idea of connections between the different parts of the empire and to promote knowledge, public knowledge. You could say this was a big public relations exercise, really, to create public knowledge of the power of empire in its constructive relationships between the white dominions and Britain, with the colonial empire, if you like. That's to say, the non-white areas of empire, which were seen rather differently. Race is always lingering there in terms of British perceptions of empire. It's always a factor. India is kind of sort of a halfway house between the white dominions. That's to say, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, South Africa, and the, if you like, the more clear-cut colonies, such as the African colonies, for example. Many of the people involved in this didn't really share some of the perspectives of Leopold Amory. They were much more, if you like, liberal, even to the left in some respects. And Stephen Tallents is one of those people. He becomes secretary to the EMB, goes on to have quite a glittering career in the media later on. But he heads the EMB, and his notion really is to try to create a sense of the empire as a whole, as a unit, if you like, and to promote the connections between different parts of empire by promoting innovation, scientific innovations, and knowledge of scientific innovations. They spent a lot of time dealing with what could be called agro-science. You know, and they had, although they had a modest budget of about £1 million a year, which was quite a small budget for an organisation like this, they did actually invest in some research establishments as well. One of those, for example, was involved in growing hardy grasses for parts of empire like the Australian outback and other colonies, to try to promote more resilient forms of, in this case, grasses. But they were involved in all sorts of other aspects of agriculture as well, and promoting of agricultural research. So it was quite wide-ranging, the EMB. But we're more interested, perhaps, in the visual propaganda. Now, it wasn't just film. It was also posters and various other artworks, and I'm going to show you some examples of those in a minute. But here, this is Stephen Tallents and his notion of the Empire Marketing Board, which I think is to the left of Leo Amory's. You know, he was interested in making connections with commercial organizations and many of their films were actually partly sponsored by commercial bodies. Things like the Ceylon tea propaganda agency, which was, which actually put money into films. One particular film, which I would have liked to show a clip from, but I think the technology is not going to allow us to do that. But I can certainly point you in the direction of seeing that film, called Song of Ceylon, and it's available on the British Film Institute website in good quality, and you can see it for free, and it's really worth seeing. It's about 40 minutes in length. It's a beautiful film. That's kind of, if you like, the sort of the culmination of the work of the film unit of the Empire Marketing Board. Talents was involved in the EMB in more general terms, of course. And his, you can see here, there's lots of references in this little quote from him to sowing and planting, tending and harvesting, and very much trying to sell empire goods, sometimes quite literally empire goods, things like, as I've suggested, tea and other products, and I'll show you some of the marketing for some of the other products. Some of it will be very familiar to you, because I think, for those of us who remember back before the period of the common market, there were various marketing boards around, some of which were still in existence even after the Second World War, and some of them related to empire. And I certainly remember some of the legacies of this in terms of tea marketing, for example. And one remembers dairy products from New Zealand and Australia, etc. These sorts of things. New Zealand lamb, for example. This is the age in which government saw it as its business to try and promote such things. So there's some. So this is one of the maps. I'm afraid it's not a very good resolution map, but there was a lot of propaganda around the, and when I say propaganda, I don't necessarily mean it was not true. The best propaganda is the truth, in a way. It's just it's never the whole truth, and it's never really a critical view. It's a particular view that you want to put across to people. And certainly here you see quite a famous map showing you the connectedness of the empire. The idea of the empire as a system of communications, of trade, and of people connected to each other. The notion, if you like, of one big family. Because the people who were involved in the EMB tended to rather view the empire as something that could be, in a way, modernized. That they very often didn't like the term empire. They preferred the term Commonwealth. Although technically at this stage the Commonwealth really only applied to the white dominions. But they liked the idea of a more democratic empire, and many of the impetuses, if you like, for the EMB's existence was the fact that after the First World War, adult males in Britain had the vote, women had the vote, not on an equal basis with men until the end of the 20s, but democracy was new, really. I mean, and there were great fears, particularly amongst people like Stanford Baldwin and his government, that the working class people in particular might not be able to use their votes, and might, horror of horrors, actually vote in socialism. This was a great fear. And so part of the rather paternalistic attitude that we see through this is a notion of educating people to be responsible citizens in a democratic system. And I think that does extend to many of the people involved in the film unit as well. One in particular, John Grissom, who we'll talk about in a moment. I've just got a few. I'm just going to go through these quite quickly because I'm not going to linger on these. So these are some of the beautiful, I think they're rather beautiful, posters related to empire, produced by some really, really talented artists, I think. you know, people like Shoesmith. And you can just do if you're interested in this sort of art, do an internet search, an image search on Google, and you can see a lot of these posters. There is actually a booklet published by, I think, Manchester Art Gallery, because they did an exhibition of these posters a few years ago, and they're absolutely staggeringly interesting, I think. And you know, people like Shoesmith, who was very well known for his, you know, his posters of ships. And they were freelancers really who were employed by the EMB to produce really a large quantity of art in different ways to sell different things. Here's another one by Alan Sennett. Alan Sennett was another quite famous poster artist at the time. And they're trying to promote, in a sense, one of the things the EMB wants to promote is change within empire, change within the colonial empire. And so much of the focus is upon the contrast between old ways and traditional ways of doing things and newer ways of doing things. But what's interesting is that they tend now not to be condemning of the old ways, but to say, well, this is a good way of doing things, but modernity will make things more efficient, will improve people's lives. And that's one of the themes that the Empire Marketing Board really wanted to push. There were a number of, there was a film connected to this, to the Empire Christmas Pudding. It was a film that was called One Family, and very much promoting this idea of the empire as a family. And a young boy goes around trying to collect the ingredients for a Christmas pudding made from ingredients supplied from empire. And you can see that here in this poster. You can also see on the left Frank Newbold. Frank Newbold was perhaps the best known of the poster artists of the time. Very, very stylish posters, very modernist. That's something that always strikes me about the artwork of the EMB. You know, it's modernism. It's using a lot of the innovations of the early 20th century and style of the early 20th century and bringing it into a commercial art. There's lots of examples of this indeed. So I've got quite a few, probably far too many. This is another great example of modernism. This is part of a triptych, I think it was. Ooh, sorry, it's jogged on there. Just go back to it. You know, it's very modernist. If you're familiar with, you know, some of the artists of the time, even some of the futurist art, some people may be familiar with some of that, which I think is people like Nevinson, for example. There's a lot of connections there, I think. One of the things, of course, that they wanted to promote was this notion of the empire, as I've said, as being modern, of the things that the empire does well, Britain being the heartland of industrial production, and his posters tend to focus on this particular triptych, tends to focus upon that. Here's another Harrison poster linked to the Christmas pudding idea. And here you can see there's loads of this sort of thing, really. The notion that you want to buy empire goods. There were also buy British campaigns going on at the time, but buy empire goods, this becomes a very, very powerful argument, especially from 1932 onwards, when you do have imperial preference as a consequence of the slump in trade, and the EMB, which is only in existence until 1933, of course, but it does start to promote empire goods really very vigorously, and this notion of food from the empire, that becomes a major factor. Here's another example of this. You know, here's New Zealand lamb, for example, Australian butter. You know, again, this is. I think these are it's quite striking, really. Perhaps not really in the modernist vein so much, although there's a hint of modernism within these posters. I'm going to move on now to talk a little bit more about Grierson, because John Grierson, is the key figure in the film unit. The film unit was set up in 1927 to 28. Grissom was appointed. He was an interesting character. He's a sociologist really by training, and he'd worked in the United States. He'd been a film critic, and Grierson had coined the phrase documentary film, which in 1926, in relation to a particular documentary that some of you may be familiar with, and that's Robert Flaherty's documentary, Nanook of the North, which is a beautiful film about the Inuit people. Flaherty was a Canadian documentary filmmaker, an ethnographer in many respects, almost, and he'd been involved in making a number of films in the mid to late 1920s. He made a film in the South Seas, Moana. He also made a film with the great German film director F.W. Murnau called Taboo, about South Seas, although he was sacked from the making of that film. Flaherty was a very difficult character to work with, and he was always getting sacked from projects. But Grierson admired him very much, and he was determined to collar Flaherty to actually make a film for the Empire Marketing Board. Grierson is a very, very important figure in British documentary cinema. In fact, in world documentary cinema, because Grierson headed the EMB film unit, which then became, in 1933, it became the GPO film unit, the General Post Office film unit, which then, during the war, became the Crown that made all those tremendous wartime propaganda films. So, you know, he made he was responsible himself for making one film, Drifters, but producing many, many other films. He was a very interesting guy indeed, who had particular views about the democratic, you know, he believed that cinema, that film, was a democratic art form, and that it had a social mission, a mission to really to help, if you like, improve society by, rather than focusing upon the sort of the rather fanciful stuff of Hollywood, he wanted to focus very much on social reality. So his film, which is Drifters of 1929, was about the North Sea herring fleet. And again, you know, most of this is now available on YouTube or the British Film Institute website. You know, these are films that are no longer really, I think, not many of them are in copyright now, and you can get free access to see them. Drifters is a remarkable film, shot very much on board ships, which is difficult to do. He put his, I think he put his life in danger actually at times making the film, and it's a fascinating study, I think, and the point of it is to show what risks ordinary people, in this case fishermen, ran to actually bring home products that were vital to Britain's, to the food supply in Britain. Herring was much more common then than it is now. Got to Drifters, a film that you can get to see, and I really do recommend Drifters as a starting point for the Empire Marketing Board films. It really does deal very well with you know, with its subject, and you get a very good sense of the, you know, the sheer physical and dangerous work that the fishermen are engaged in, which is very much Grierson's argument. Grissom believed that, you know, film was a democratic medium, and people had to know about the risks that working people ran in their daily lives. Hence, the second well, one of the early films, it wasn't the second one, but one of the early films was called Industrial Britain, which shows coal miners working. He actually got Flaherty to work on that film. And it's, again, a beautiful film, actually, with a lot of shots of various industries, the potteries, for example, cotton, textiles, and heavy engineering, really, really selling the idea of Britain as a workshop. Had a huge influence on other filmmakers. Although Flaherty, again, managed to get himself sacked from the making of the film because he was just a difficult person to work with. But the film was then edited by a guy called Edgar Anstey, who was to become very, very important in the documentary film movement of the mid-1930s. And he put it together and created, really, again, a very interesting film that's worth looking at. Industrial Britain, that's called. And then there were many other films. They made at least 100 films in their short life. Some of them were very, very brief films, very short films indeed, a few minutes, which was quite common for documentary films at the time. Some of the films were made out of existing film stock that they recut and re-edited and sometimes put soundtracks on when sound became available. Most of the films that they made had some kind of sound put on, even if the sound wasn't recorded at the time, if it was recorded in the studio, as some of it was. But the films, such as Windmills in Barbados, Cargo from Jamaica, Song of Ceylon, which I'm going to talk about because I believe it to be the most, the most beautiful of the films that the EMB made. And another film, Arthur Elton's beautiful film, Shadow on the Mountain, which I should have said really earlier on that the influences on these filmmakers came from the Soviet cinema of the 1920s and from German cinema. Soviet films, you think of Eisenstein, but there were other filmmakers like Pudovkin, Alexander Dovzhenko, and Dziga Vertov, who were making films which were very, very beautiful films to look at often, and films about modern society. In the case of Dziga Vertov, his beautiful film, The Man with the Movie Camera, had a huge impact. There were many films that were films about cities and films about modern urban life, and that was one of those films. And they had a huge impact upon the way that the documentary filmmakers operated. They often used something called montage, which is really editing, rhythmic editing, to bring home the power. For example, rhythmic editing of machinery working, sometimes with music on top of it. I think probably the best example of that was not made by the EMB, but was made by the successor organisation, the GPO Film Unit, which were the same people actually who moved to work for the General Post Office, and it's one which most people know. It's called Nightmail, using the music of Benjamin Britten and the poetry of W.H. Auden, and that is a tremendously powerful film, using the rhythm of the locomotive with Benjamin Britten's music and Auden's poetry. This is a fantastic film, but that's a little later on in the mid-1930s. But it wouldn't have been possible. Nightmail would not have been possible had it not been for the work of the Empire Marketing Board Film Unit. It was the films that were made, I think, they sort of culminated in The Song of Ceylon, which was 1934, and this was, I think, one of the most interesting of the early documentary films. And I wanted to show a clip from it, but the technologies won't let me do it, I think, because and if you can get to see Song of Ceylon, it's a film that's in 4 parts. It's supposed to be promoting tea, and yet there's not much about tea in the film, and it was partly funded by the Ceylon tea propaganda bureau. Money was made available to make the film. It was made by Basil Wright, who would go on to make a lot of films, including wartime propaganda films. And he went to Ceylon. He was absolutely bowled over by the culture. And the film is a kind of anthropological film in many ways, but it's not a racist film. I think it's a film that's very respectful of the people, of the Sinhalese people, and of their Buddhist religious practices. The film shows you Buddhist ceremonies. It shows you the people of Ceylon in their fishing, building houses, creating artifacts, woodwork, for example, woodworking. It also shows you briefly, and it's very brief, it shows you them working on the tea plantations, but it doesn't dwell upon that. The film would be criticised from the left for not presenting it as exploitation, but this is a film that was funded by the tea, by the tea companies themselves partly, so it was unlikely to do that. But the film is very lyrical, and there's a moment in the film where they used sound to great effect. Particularly, there's a moment where they're showing modern communications, so you get a lot of interference on radio, and you get a lot of noises of the radio. You hear stock prices being quoted. You see a lot of shots of commercial vessels coming into Colombo harbour, and there's lots of talk about the connections, the trading connections between Britain and Sri Lanka, Ceylon, but also the connections, I think, are also cultural linkages as well. They're made in the film. The film utilises both kind of quite a sort of quite fairly modernist soundtrack, really, which is very much drawing upon local sounds and recreating those in the studio. They bring Ceylonese artists across to. There's a drummer, for example, is brought to Britain to record some of the soundtrack. They bring a dancer. The last section of the film is really a display of dancing. Really quite exciting as well, and beautifully paced actually with the soundtrack. The film won the Gold Award at the Belgian Film Festival in 1935. The film was made initially by the Empire Marketing Board then, but it was just at the time that the EMB was being wound up in 1933. And so the film was finished and actually issued under the auspices of the General Post Office. But it was, the idea came from the Empire Marketing Board, and it very much links to that kind of propaganda that was really being pushed. This notion that you wanted British people to engage with its empire, I think that was what lay behind the motivations for the marketing board. The idea that the British people didn't know much about their empire, but they should know more about it. That the empire, was a unit. And I think that I was going to say a little bit about propaganda and about, because one of my areas that I've written about quite a lot. The nature of propaganda and how it works, and how it might work in the case of the Empire Marketing Board. Grissom was very, very well aware that he was a propagandist. He never tried to suggest otherwise, but he didn't see it as a negative. The term propaganda has been very much associated with negative ideas. We think of Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia. They have they have ministries of propaganda. In Britain, in wartime, we had ministries of information. We don't give propaganda, we give information. And sometimes people associated with the EMB prefer to use the term public relations. But it seems to me that this was propaganda, was selling a view of the world, and Grissom was very well aware of that. And when you look at definitions of propaganda, this is one from Richard Taylor, who was a specialist on Nazi and Soviet film propaganda. Propaganda is concerned with the transmission of ideas and values from one person or group of persons to another. Where propagation is the action, their propaganda is the activity. This notion of propagation, this notion of selling something, it's interesting because I think that in other cultures, in non-Anglophone cultures, certainly when I lived in Spain, it was very common to refer to the direct marketing that came through the letterbox as propaganda. That propaganda is about selling something, whether that be ideas, whether that be commodities. And it's clear that the Empire Marketing Board was in the business of both, if you like, selling the idea of commodities, of selling empire goods, of promoting the riches, if you like, of the empire to British people. Also, some of these films were shown in other countries, but the main market for the EMB was the domestic market, was the domestic public. And there's no doubt that it was promoting a view of empire, a particular view of empire, and a view of empire that I think was perhaps more modern than views that you'd had before the First World War. And I think this is to do with the changes that have taken place since the war. The empire had shown itself to be immensely valuable during the First World War. 1.5 million Indians had volunteered to serve in the armed forces. People had volunteered from all around the empire. There'd been very little in the way of conscription, except in Britain and some of the White Dominions. And even there, sometimes that conscription was voted down. But, there was a very, very big contribution to the empire, to the war effort from the empire. And this was reflected in some of the changes in the 1920s. So the coming, for example, of the idea of the Commonwealth, an idea that had been around for a long time, but now it's kind of formalized in the 1920s and in 1931. It's, of course, these are the White Dominions. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Newfoundland, and also the new Irish Free State, which was a dominion by the Treaty of 1921. But on the other hand, of course, that sort of slightly masked the fact that really it was a breakaway. But technically, yeah, it was a dominion of the empire. And one of the big questions was, will India become a dominion? Many Indian nationalists had believed that was possible, and India's support for Britain during the war sort of led to the thoughts of that. It didn't materialise, and it becomes clear in the 1930s that the British governments do not, at this stage, intend to create India as a dominion. However, change is in the air, I think. That's what I'm trying to say, really. There's also the fact that the Russian Revolution creates a sense of concern that the working class people may well be attracted to left-wing ideas, and that there is within that also, of course, a hostility to empire. In the case of Britain, that tends to be overplayed. Really, when the Communist Party will never be a major force in British politics. The Labour Party has rather different views. Although it's a critic of empire in many respects, there's also a sort of sense in which they want to reform empire rather than to completely bring empire to a sudden end. And many British Labour politicians described as, in a small way, imperialists, really. So what you're seeing then here is, with the EMB, is perhaps a liberal view of empire, a notion that empire is something to be celebrated, but it's the hope is that that democracy will be expanded within empire, and it's a democratic view that people like Grissom have, and Stephen Tallant's as well. The hope that what we can have is a democratic empire in which colonies become voluntary participants in a shared project, which is mutually beneficial. That's the idea. This is just my sort of summary, really, in the sense of the nature of propaganda. I mean, I put this up because I think it's it's worth considering if you're asking yourself, how do we define propaganda? It seems to me that it's intentional. It doesn't happen by accident. Yes, you can have something that's political, that's not, the makers don't understand the politics of what they're making, possibly, but that wouldn't be propaganda. I think propaganda has to be intentional. It has to be a conscious act. It wants to tell its audience something quite specific. It's got a purpose to it, and historians need to ask what that purpose is. It's also not necessarily all lies. Truth is very powerful propaganda. If you think about the propaganda at the moment, the propaganda that we should all get vaccinated against COVID, that seems to me like a good idea to promote. It seems to me that is the truth. It's not lies, although some people clearly think it is, but I think they're in a small minority. So, giving up smoking, surely it's quite good to try and persuade people to do that. Still propaganda, I would argue. Propaganda doesn't have to be negative. It doesn't have to be associated with vile regimes like the Nazi regime. It could be associated with democratic regimes. And clearly, Grissom believed that's what he was doing. He thought that his propaganda was good propaganda that would, improve people's lives and improve people's appreciation of the links between Britain and its empire. The aim, is to gain influence over public opinion. That's definitely the intention here. It's an attempt to influence people, and it tends to use, in the modern age, mass media. It's now speaking to a large audience. That's why film was seen as such potent propaganda, because you could actually speak to so many people. The thing about film is, it's a visual medium. With the coming of sound, that gives another dimension to cinema. You don't have to be able to read to get the message, and that's a powerful aspect of cinema. It's a visual art form, and also it forms a mass spectacle. You watch films together. Well, maybe you don't today so much. Very often we're watching them on our own, possibly, or with a small group of people. But, essentially, cinema is a social activity, and that has its own dynamic, which is significant. It's theatrical, as it were. All of these things, and I could go on for a lot longer on propaganda, but I want to just keep it manageable, really. I can make these slides available to anyone who's interested, of course. So that's no problem. So propaganda, then, we might want to think about how that's working in this case. These posters that are trying to sell an image that's a very positive image. So the EMB, clearly, it was promoting empire, so it wasn't going to say negative things about empire. It wasn't going to give criticism of empire. Many of the filmmakers were to the left of the liberals, in a way, and many of them would feel rather uncomfortable about what with the EMB. When they got to work for the GPO film unit, they had more scope to make some much more powerful social commentary. One of the films that I think is really important film was called Housing Problems, and was made in the mid-30s by Edgar Anstey and others, and it reveals it reveals the real state of poverty, of poor housing. It was actually partly sponsored by gas companies. And yet it's an incredibly powerful film. It also uses interviews of, you know, real people, as it were, you know, people living in terrible housing situations. And it had a big impact, actually, upon the social housing movement in the mid-1930s. These films were important. These films did make a difference. Another film called Coalface looked at the working conditions of coal miners, which, as you know, a lot of miners died every year, and you know, terrible conditions that they worked in. I think these films, which really do merit our attention as historians, they tell us a lot about the period. They tell us a lot about attitudes and the way that attitudes were changing. You know, the way that scientists in the 1930s were starting to study nutrition amongst the working classes and starting to realise how poor people's diets were. This all fed into rationing during the Second World War, of course. And filmmakers were part of that. They weren't all of it, but they were part of this broader social project. And people like John Grissom were very, very supportive of that. Grissom was not a socialist, but he was certainly left of centre, believed that the film had a mission, and he would go to Canada in the late 30s and take over the National Film Board of Canada, and would make propaganda films in Canada during the war, promoting, of course, the Empire war effort, which was very important. I just got one or two other little slides here. I actually can't remember how many slides I've got, but this was an official view, which I thought. This Edward Short was president of the British Board of Film Censors. He understood that cinema was an instrument of propaganda. They wanted to use cinema. This is in a sense the state. Well, the BBFC was not a state organisation. It was actually set up by the industry itself in 1911. But it was appointed by the Home Secretary. The director of the president, rather, of the BBFC was appointed by the Home Secretary. So he had a role, as a sort of a public role, and he realised that this is a way of shaping people's minds. You know. This seems to me to be very much the use of propaganda for public purposes. The same theme repeated over and over again might be most desirable. Well, I'm not making a parallel, but Hitler said exactly the same thing about these propaganda, and you find these kind of ideas coming up a lot. I think that's the last of my slides. I suspect it's the last of my slides. And I did promise Linda that I would pause a little short of the hour to take questions. There is an awful lot more to be said about the Empire Marketing Board and its legacy, which was quite substantial. But I think the social ethos filtered through into the BBC, and those incredible film documentaries made during the Second World War were made by many of the people who'd worked for the Empire Marketing Board and for the GPO film unit. You know, fires were started. One of the most important, who was too young really to work for the EMB, but he worked for the GPO film unit, was Humphrey Jennings, probably the most important single director. And if you've not heard of Humphrey Jennings, I do seriously think, if you're interested in cinema, it's worth finding out about his films, because they are extraordinary films. And we see a lot of clips from his films in war documentaries. So I'm going to pause there and open things up for questions. So I'll try and scan the chat.
Well, I don't know whether you can see the questions, but Kyron has actually said exactly what I was going to say. Did it work? Is there any evidence that the EMB actually increased the sale of Empire produce?
We don't really know that. we don't really know. We can't we can't tell what the effect ethos of serving. It's Reith, isn't it? John Reith, who of course became involved with the BBC at its founding, and had his own ethos of public service. And the remit is to entertain and to educate people. And I think that ties up quite nicely with the ethos of John Grierson. I think John Grierson was more left-wing than Reith. But the idea that the BBC has a social purpose is the same ethos as the documentary filmmakers. And if you look at documentary filmmakers in the 60s, somebody like Ken Loach, think of Cathy Come Home. They are taking perhaps a more radical perspective, but they are developing some of the ideas of the early documentary filmmakers, and they're very influenced by them. Although, of course, Loach is well to the left, I think, of almost all of the documentary filmmakers working for the EMB and the GPO film unit. Hopefully that gives you something of an answer. I'm just looking down the list of questions to see if there are any others that I can focus on a bit legacy. Yeah, Sri Lanka, Ceylon, Richard. Made by the tea industry. Was it Commonwealth funded? Yes, it was actually. Petroleum companies, Chalmex, for example, funded quite a lot of very interesting documentaries. Some of them quite innovative documentaries in the mid-1930s. British Film Institute. Have a look on their website. They sometimes give you free access to some of these documentaries. Some of them really short, like 5 minutes or so, or even less. But a lot of them were partly funded by commercial organisations. Yes, they were. So yes, that was a factor. Sometimes the EMB was funded by the state, but many of its films were funded by private commercial organisations, or part funded by them. And that was true of the GPO film unit as well. But which countries, this is Chiron, the ones that they focused on, they ranged around. There's quite a lot of films made in the West Indies. There were not so many in Africa, actually. There were, I'm not sure if there were any others made in Ceylon. I think that Song of Ceylon was the only one. There were quite a lot made in the White Dominions, Australia, Canada. So they ranged around the empire, actually. Was it the White Dominions or the Bain Colonies? You said, you know, both. Raw materials, process manufacturing. Raw materials, no, they tended to more focus on processed goods. One of the problems that they didn't cover, actually, was some of the mining operations in West Africa, which there is film of. But when you look at it, it's very disturbing. A very, very different idea comes out from those, where Africans are being used not exactly as forced labour, although they would be during the war, during the Second World War. There's lots of questions that were not tackled by the EMB. And, you know, yeah, it leaves a lot of, you know, the British Empire. Yeah, it may have had progressive elements to it in the 1920s and 30s, but maybe we shouldn't get carried away by that. It was still an empire that was capable of resorting to violence, and did as it did during the Second World War, of course. Tineke, just curious, you talked about the spreading of propaganda through films. Did the empire also use other forms of literature propaganda? Well, yeah, there was a massive literature of empire, which extends to some very popular writers. People like Conan Doyle could be seen within that. G.A. Henty, many other writers. John Buchan, his books were really promoting perspectives of empire as well. So there was a huge literature of empire. which then fed into cinema. Because what I haven't talked about feature films. The 1930s, there were a lot of imperial feature films. Alexander Korda, he made a lot of films. Sanders of the River, for example. The Four Feathers. I think there have been about 4 or 5 versions of that made. Lots and lots of adventure stories were made into feature films in the 1930s. The Drum, Kipling, very, very influential. So yeah, the cinema drew upon literature very heavily. How big was the MP? How many people employ? It wasn't a huge organisation. I think we're talking about dozens of people rather than hundreds of people. I don't have an absolute figure. I couldn't find a figure. I did look. I couldn't find an absolute figure for the total number of people employed. Many people were employed on a freelance basis. Many of the artists were not full-time employees. But in the film unit, there was a core. But you're talking about, about 20 or 30 people in the film unit. This was not big. So this is not a big organisation, but as I said, a million budget of £1 million a year didn't go very far, even in those days, and that was cut. In many ways, the EMB was a victim of the Depression, and a victim of the fact that by 1933 it didn't have many political fans in government. Which was one of the reasons that the EMB came to an end. But as I say, it came to an end. In a way, the film unit didn't end. The film unit became the GPO film unit. And John Grierson was employed by the post office. Again, a state organisation, to make some incredible propaganda films about the work of the post office, which of course involved telephones, involved telegraph, and involved a lot of other areas as well. Those GPO film unit films, there were hundreds of them made. They really are quite extraordinary, actually, worth having a look at as well. Many of them have been put out by the British Film Institute. One of the things that I can say is that you can actually get access to many of these films now free, either through the BFI website or through YouTube, and then they've commercially put them out as DVDs. So if you're interested, you can certainly track these things down. I think there's a lot of literature on the subject as well. I don't know if there's any other questions. We've I think I've got through. Sorry, Tineke, would you say the reason for the creation was the beginning of the decline of empire? Well, that's a very interesting question. Was it the beginning of the decline of empire? No, I don't think it was really. In hindsight, it might look as if it was, but there was no sense in the minds of the people involved in these organisations that this was the beginning of the end of empire. No, I don't think it was. I think that they were aware that nationalism was on the rise. They were aware of the internationalism, for example. But the idea, in 1939, as Britain went to war in 1939, there was really no thought in the minds of British politicians that this was the end of empire. I think that's very much the current idea. There are historians who say otherwise, though. Some historians believe it was the beginning of the end of empire. Corelli Barnett, for example, he wrote the book called The Decline of British Power. I think it's 3 books, in fact, where he talks about it as being so. Dax, how much, if any, was shown in the Dominions and Colonies? Some of them, I can't tell you exactly, but some of these films were. Some of them didn't go down very well, actually, in the colonies. In the Dominions, they tended to. In the colonies, they didn't necessarily go down too well. But their main market was actually the domestic market, was the British people. This was very much about selling empire to the British, which raises the question: Why would they need to do that? If the British people were so connected to their empire, why would you need to do it? Well, maybe it's an indication that they weren't that connected. Maybe Bernard Porter is right, or at least substantially right. I think that the truth comes somewhere in the middle of the Porter-Mackenzie debate. But I think there's, it's a good question. It's a good question, to ask. Really, how important was empire to the ordinary person in the street in Britain? And I think the answer is perhaps not that important. So the EMB's job was to try and sell it to them and tell them why it was important. Whether they bought it or not, we can't really tell.